A fermented banana peel left to sit for 10 days in a sealed jar holds more usable potassium than most bags of shop-bought tomato feed. Farmers and cottage gardeners across the north of England were feeding their tomatoes this way long before any fertilizer ever came in a plastic bottle. 3 times the fruit from something most people scrape straight into the bin without a second thought. I grew up on a small holding in the Yorkshire Dales, in a stone cottage with a vegetable patch that fed our whole family through the year. My grandfather kept that garden going through some very lean winters, and he never once bought a bag of fertilizer in his life. Everything that came out of our kitchen went back into the soil in one form or another, and nothing was ever wasted, not even a banana skin. I watched him ferment scraps in old glass jars lined up on the windowsill above the sink, and I watched the tomato plants that got that liquid grow taller, greener, and heavier with fruit than any of the others in the village. Neighbors used to ask him what he was doing differently because his tomatoes ripened earlier and hung heavier on the vine than anyone else's on our lane. He would just smile and tell them it was down to good soil, which was true. But it was also down to a jar of banana peels, quietly working away in the larder. These were not theories he read in a book. These were things he did with his own 2 hands, every single summer, because the harvest had to be good or the family went without. I am sharing this now because very few people still know how to do it properly, and I think that is a shame worth putting right. Somewhere along the way, this knowledge got pushed aside. Garden centers began selling bottled feeds with bright labels and confident promises, and people stopped looking in their own kitchen bins for the answer. A bottle of tomato feed costs money every single season, while a banana peel costs nothing at all, and there was never much profit to be made from telling people that. So the old method quietly fell out of use, not because it stopped working, but because nobody was left to remind people it existed. It happens with a great deal of household knowledge once there is money to be made in making people forget it. What you are about to hear is not a theory dreamed up on the internet. This method was used across hundreds of English gardens during years when buying fertilizer simply was not an option, particularly through the war years when every scrap of food waste was treated as a resource rather than rubbish. During the Dig for Victory campaigns of the 1940s, families were encouraged to turn every available patch of land into a productive garden, and nothing edible or nearly edible was ever thrown out while there was still a use for it. Kitchen scraps, ash from the fire, and even old tea leaves all found their way back into the vegetable beds. Because shop-bought fertilizer was scarce and every household had to make do with what it already had, it worked then, under real pressure, with real families depending on the harvest to see them through winter. It still works now, and it costs you nothing but a little patience. The first thing to understand is why a banana peel works at all. A banana peel is loaded with potassium, along with smaller amounts of phosphorus, calcium, and magnesium, all of which sit inside the fibrous skin waiting to be released. Fresh, a peel breaks down slowly in the soil and much of that potassium stays locked. Inside the plant fiber, where roots cannot easily reach it, fermenting the peel changes that entirely. The process breaks down the tough cell walls through natural microbial activity, and it releases the minerals into a liquid form that plant roots can take up almost immediately. This is the same basic principle behind Old English comfrey feeds and nettle feeds, both of which country gardeners have used for generations. But the banana ferment is simpler to make and far less smelly to keep near the house. Comfrey feed has a reputation for clearing a room the moment the lid comes off, which is exactly why so many gardeners prefer banana peel when they need something to keep indoors through a cold spell. Potassium, in particular, is the mineral tomatoes need most. Once they begin to flower and set fruit, because it governs how well a plant moves water and sugars into the developing fruit, a plant short on potassium will flower weakly and drop blossoms before they ever become tomatoes, which is the single most common reason home gardeners end up with plenty of green leaves and very little fruit to show for it. Victorian kitchen gardeners understood this balance instinctively, even without the scientific language for it, and many old gardening notebooks from that period mention feeding fruiting plants with what they simply called sweetened water, which was often nothing more than a mineral-rich ferment, much like the one we are describing here. Before we move on, it is worth saying plainly that none of this requires anything you do not already have. No special equipment, no seed catalog purchases, no trip to the garden center for anything other than tomato plants themselves. Just banana peels you would otherwise throw away, a jar you likely already own, and a bit of patience while nature does the actual work. That simplicity is exactly why this method survived for so long in households that had very little to spare. The second part is collecting your peels properly, and this is where most people go wrong from the very start. Do not use peels that have already gone black and rotten in the fruit bowl, because by that point, much of the useful sugar and mineral content has already broken down and fed nothing but flies. You want peels from bananas that are ripe but still yellow, eaten within a day or two of turning spotty, because that is when the sugar and mineral content inside the skin is at its highest. Wash each peel gently under cold water before you use it, just to remove any surface dust or spray residue. Then cut it into rough pieces about an inch long. Cutting the peel increases the surface area, which speeds up fermentation considerably. And it also helps the peel sink and stay submerged in the liquid rather than floating and drying out on the surface. Keep a small container in the kitchen specifically for collecting peels through the week, because you will need several peels to make a proper batch. And few households eat enough bananas in a single sitting to fill a jar all at once. 5 to 6 peels is usually enough for a jar of a reasonable size, which for most households means saving peels for around a week before you have enough to begin. The third step is choosing the right jar, and glass is always the better choice over plastic. A wide-mouthed glass jar, something like an old jam jar or a large pickling jar, works far better than a narrow bottle, because you need room to push the peels well below the surface of the water. My grandfather used old cider jars for this, scrubbed clean, and left to dry in the sun before use, and he swore that anything that had once held vinegar or cider seemed to ferment faster, though I suspect that was more habit than science. Fill the jar roughly a third full with cut banana peel, then top it up with clean water, leaving a couple of inches of space at the top for the mixture to bubble and expand as fermentation begins. Do not seal the lid tightly at this stage because the fermentation process produces gas, and a sealed jar with no room to breathe can build enough pressure to crack or even shatter. A loose lid or a cloth secured with string over the mouth of the jar allows gas to escape while keeping flies and dust well away from the mixture. This is the same technique used for generations to make traditional country wines and cordials, where a loosely covered jar was left to work quietly in a cool corner of the pantry for days at a time. Keep watching, because the fourth step is where most people either succeed or fail without ever realizing why. Place the jar somewhere warm but out of direct sunlight. A larder, a pantry shelf, or a cupboard above a radiator all work well because fermentation needs gentle, steady warmth to get going properly. Direct sun heats the jar unevenly and can cause the liquid to sour rather than ferment, giving you a foul, useless mixture instead of a rich feed. Leave the jar for 7 to 10 days, stirring the contents gently once a day with a clean wooden spoon. Stirring keeps the peels submerged and distributes the microbial activity evenly through the liquid, which speeds up the breakdown and prevents mold from forming on any peel that floats to the surface. By around day 4 or 5, you should notice small bubbles rising when you stir, along with a faintly sour, slightly sweet smell, similar to the smell of a light vinegar. That smell tells you the fermentation is active and healthy, and it is one of the clearest signs that the process is working exactly as it should. Some gardeners like to keep a small notebook by the jar, jotting down the day the smell first appears and the day the color begins to darken. Since this makes it far easier to judge timing accurately on future batches, the fifth step, and one that surprises a lot of people, is knowing exactly when the ferment is ready to use. By day 10, the liquid should have turned a light amber or golden brown color, similar to weak tea, and the peels themselves should look pale, softened, and almost translucent at the edges. The smell by this point should be tangy and slightly fermented, never sharply rotten, and never overpoweringly foul. If at any point you see fuzzy white or gray mold growing on the surface, the batch is spoiled and should be discarded, because fermentation and rot are two very different processes that can look similar to an untrained eye in the early days. A properly fermented batch should never smell like decay. It should smell closer to the tang of cider vinegar, and that tang is the sign that beneficial bacteria have done their work rather than harmful ones. If you are ever unsure, trust your nose over your eyes, since smell tells you far more about a ferment's health than color ever will. Now for the sixth step, which is straining and storing your finished feed. Once the ferment is ready, strain the liquid through a piece of muslin cloth or a fine kitchen sieve into a clean jug, pressing gently on the softened peels to release the last of the liquid trapped inside them. If you do not have muslin cloth to hand, a clean tea towel or even several layers of kitchen paper set inside a colander will do the job almost as well. The strained liquid is now your concentrate, and it is far too strong to use directly on your plants without diluting it first. The spent peel pulp left behind in the sieve is not waste either, since it can go straight into your compost heap or be dug shallowly into a spare patch of soil, where it will continue breaking down and feeding the ground slowly over the following weeks. Store the strained concentrate in a sealed glass bottle in a cool, dark place, and it will keep for several weeks without spoiling. Though most gardeners find it best to use a fresh batch every fortnight through the growing season, rather than storing too much at once. Label your bottle with the date it was strained, because concentrate left too long can begin to smell unpleasantly stronger, and it is easy to lose track of how old a bottle is once several batches start lining the same shelf. The seventh step is getting the dilution right, because a concentrate used at full strength can actually harm your plants rather than help them. Mix 1 part of the strained banana ferment with 10 parts of clean water. Roughly 1 cup of concentrate to 10 cups of water, which gives you a feed strong enough to nourish the plant without overwhelming its roots. Use this diluted feed to water your tomato plants directly at the base of the stem, avoiding the leaves themselves, since wet foliage in warm weather can encourage fungal problems that undo all the good work you have just done. This diluted mixture is close in strength to the sort of liquid feed my grandfather made from comfrey leaves, though he always said the banana version was gentler and less likely to burn young roots. If you happen to mix it a little too strong by mistake, if you are ever uncertain about strength, it is always safer to dilute a little more than the recipe calls for, rather than a little less, since a mild feed simply takes slightly longer to show results, while an overly strong one can scorch tender roots within a day. But that is only the first part of what makes this method effective. The second method is where most people are genuinely surprised, because it is not a separate feed at all, but a way of making the banana ferment work even harder alongside other kitchen scraps. Crushed eggshells, saved and dried on a windowsill for a week or two, can be added to the same fermenting jar to introduce calcium into the mixture, which helps prevent blossom end rot, a common problem where the base of the tomato turns dark and leathery from a lack of available calcium in the soil. Used coffee grounds, added sparingly, bring a small amount of nitrogen into the mix, which supports leafy growth earlier in the season without overwhelming the potassium already present from the banana peel. This combined ferment was something country households leaned on heavily during rationing, when nothing edible or nearly edible was ever thrown away, and gardens had to produce as much food as possible from whatever scraps a family could spare. It is worth noting that this combined feed should still be diluted at the same 1:10 ratio before use, since adding extra ingredients does not change the golden rule that concentrated ferments must always be watered down before they touch a growing plant. A jar built this way, with banana peel, crushed eggshell, and a small amount of coffee grounds, comes remarkably close to matching a shop-bought balanced feed. At a fraction of the cost, and without a single ingredient that did not already come from your own kitchen. The ninth step concerns the soil itself, because even the best feed struggles to work in soil that cannot hold on to moisture and nutrients properly. Before you begin your feeding routine, work a generous layer of well-rotted compost or aged manure into the top few inches of soil around your tomato plants. Since this improves the soil's ability to retain both water and the nutrients you are adding through the ferment, mulching around the base of each plant with straw or grass clippings after feeding helps lock moisture in and keeps the soil temperature steadier through hot summer days, which in turn helps the roots take up nutrients more efficiently rather than losing them to rapid evaporation. This combination of good soil preparation and regular feeding is really what produces the dramatic results people notice, because no liquid feed on its own can compensate for soil that dries out and cracks between waterings. Country gardeners of the past understood soil as a living thing that needed feeding in its own right, not simply a place to plant a seed and hope for the best, and that patience with the ground itself is just as important as any single feed you pour onto it. This is where most people are surprised by how much timing changes the outcome, so pay close attention here. The final step is matching your feeding to what the plant is actually doing at each stage of its growth, because tomatoes need different things at different times of the season. In the first weeks after planting out, when the plant is establishing roots and putting on leafy growth, feed sparingly, perhaps once every 2 weeks, since too much potassium too early can slow leaf development before the plant has built a strong enough frame to support fruit later on. Once the first flower clusters appear, increased feeding to once a week, because this is exactly the stage where potassium has the greatest effect, encouraging strong flower formation and reducing the number of blossoms that drop off before setting fruit. Continue weekly feeding right through the fruiting period, and many gardeners who follow this rhythm closely report noticeably heavier trusses of fruit and fewer split or misshapen tomatoes by the end of the season, because steady potassium supports even consistent fruit development rather than sudden bursts of growth followed by stress. Towards the very end of the season, once the last trusses have set and you are simply waiting for fruit to ripen, feeding can be reduced again. Since the plant's energy at that point is best spent ripening what it already has rather than producing new growth, there is one more thing worth knowing before you start, and it concerns the mistakes that trip up nearly every beginner at least once. The most common mistake is impatience, pulling the jar out after only 3 or 4 days because the liquid already looks slightly cloudy and assuming it must be ready. A ferment that young has barely begun to break down the peel, and using it too early simply wastes your banana peels without giving your plants any real benefit. The second common mistake is using too many peels crammed into too small a jar, which leaves no room for the peels to move and often causes patches of mold. To form where peels are pressed tightly against the glass, always leave a little breathing room in the jar, even if that means starting a second batch, rather than forcing everything into one container. The third mistake, and perhaps the most damaging, is skipping the dilution step because the concentrate smells mild and seems harmless enough to pour straight onto the soil. Undiluted concentrate is far more acidic and far more concentrated in minerals than a young tomato root can safely handle. And pouring it on undiluted can scorch the fine root hairs a plant relies on to take up water, leaving the whole plant wilted and stressed for days afterward. It is always worth keeping a simple measuring cup near your feeding area specifically for this purpose. So the 1:10 ratio becomes second nature, rather than something you have to work out each time by guesswork. A fourth mistake worth mentioning is feeding too often out of eagerness to see faster results. Since more is not always better where minerals are concerned, and a plant fed twice as often as it needs can develop lush, dark leaves at the expense of actual fruit production. Stick to the weekly rhythm during flowering and fruiting, and resist the temptation to feed more heavily even when the plant is clearly responding well, because steady and consistent almost always outperforms generous and irregular. Recognizing the signs that the method is working matters just as much as following the steps themselves. So, you know to keep going rather than second-guessing yourself partway through the season. Within 2 to 3 weeks of starting a regular feeding routine, most gardeners notice thicker stems, a deeper green color in the leaves, and flower clusters that hold their blossoms rather than dropping them within days of opening. By the time the first tomatoes begin to ripen, the difference between a fed plant and an unfed plant is usually obvious, even to someone who has never grown a tomato before. With the fed plants carrying noticeably heavier trusses and fruit that ripens more evenly from top to bottom. Many gardeners who commit to this routine for a full season find their total harvest weight roughly doubles or triples compared to previous years, simply from unlocking minerals that were sitting in their kitchen bin the whole time. It is a modest amount of effort, spread out over a whole summer, for a difference that is genuinely hard to ignore once you see it in your own garden. I think often about how strange it is that something this simple was ever set aside. My grandfather never had money for fertilizer, and he never seemed to need it, because he understood that the soil around him and the scraps inside his kitchen contained everything his garden required. He was not a man given to grand statements, but he did once tell me that the land will always give back more than you put into it, provided you are willing to put something back at all. I did not understand what he meant when I was young, standing beside him while he stirred that jar on the windowsill, but I understand it now every summer when my own tomato vines bend under the weight of fruit. What was lost was not the knowledge itself, not really, but the habit of looking for solutions close to home before reaching for something bought in a shop. It is a small habit, almost too small to notice, but it changes how a person sees their own kitchen, their own garden, and the scraps they might otherwise throw away without a second thought. Once you start seeing a banana peel as a resource rather than rubbish, it becomes hard to look at any kitchen scrap quite the same way again. Anyone with a windowsill, a jar, and a bit of patience can reclaim that habit. And I find something quietly satisfying in knowing that. It costs nothing to try, and the only real risk is a summer spent wondering why you did not start sooner. If this has been useful to you, there are more methods where this one came from. I share a new one every day, drawn from the same kind of quiet, practical knowledge my grandfather passed on to me. The old ways are still here. You just have to know where to look.